Hi everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. Today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to configure SSH tunneling using the remote port forwarding method, right? On Debian 11. If you have seen my local port forwarding tutorial, you would have gotten some of the basics. If you have not seen my local port forwarding video, you can always check it out in my YouTube channel. Okay, so in today's setup, okay, the objective that we are going to try and achieve is to allow the administrator, right, demo to delete, to establish a RDP session to a internal RDP host, right? And in a typical use case for remote tunneling, right, it is really to allow um, you know internal server, right, in your network that does not have a public IP address mapping, right? That means that they are not exposed directly to the public internet through a public IP mapping, right? To allow the administrator to reach that internal host through a SSH tunnel, right? And of course, in the tutorial, we'll need a SSH server, right? Acting as like a gateway or a reverse proxy for the administrator to get access to the internal host. In a lot of tutorial or in a lot of cases, you'll hear is like a poor man VPN, right? So, of course, there are a lot of use cases, right? For SSH, one of the reason why we are learning about remote SSH um, port forwarding is because a lot of the attacks, right, used by the cyber criminal to get a reverse shell or to get console access to your internal server is through SSH reverse um, or remote port forwarding, right? There are a lot of ways for attackers to try and get access to your servers in your internal network, right? Machines that are not directly exposed to the public internet, and however, SSH um, reverse shell or SSH reverse tunneling is a very widely used method by the cyber criminal, and therefore it's important for us to learn, right, to understand how it works, and from the learning, hopefully be able to put in measures to protect our servers internally. Okay, so the commands are pretty straightforward, right? If you are like me, when I started out, you know, dwindling with the SSH technology, right? I always try and figure out and picture where do I key in the SSH command, what are the parameters and how it works, right? So hopefully this visual diagram will help you to get a better understanding when you are trying to look at the various tunneling options. So for remote port forwarding um, scenario, right? The command for to be issued is done on the host itself, right? The internal host that you want to allow access from the public internet, right? That is where you initiate the SSH command. Okay, of course, you will need a SSH server, right? To connect to act as a gateway, right, for the public to get access to the internal server here. So we have a internal server running Debian and XRDP, right? And then we have a Debian SSH server, right, with a private IP address and a public IP address. So what we will need to do is to, once we establish the SSH tunnel or the remote port forwarding tunnel, right, we can then configure the uh, firewall to allow port 8443 in our tutorial, you can specify any port, right, that are not already being used, right? So port 8443 is like trying to masquerade 3389 as a maybe HTTPS port, right? As 8443 is commonly used by a lot of application to for administration, right? Because 443 are commonly used for HTTPS, and then there are a lot of machines that might uses 8443 just to not have the port conflict, right? So we'll allow that through the firewall on the Debian machine. I'm using uncomplicated firewall, so I'll show you how to do that. And then for remote port forwarding, you need one more step, which is to configure the gateway ports, right? To allow the gateway ports configuration through the SSH server. So it allows for tunneling through a map port in our case here. Okay, and then we will test out, of course, the RDP connection to the RDP host through the SSH server itself. Okay, so with that, let's hop over to the tutorial or to the console. So I've already connected to the internal RDP host. So that is example of, you should have access to your internal host. And then now you want to configure access from a remote perspective. For example, today we have a lot of administrator working from home, right? You want to basically allow the remote access from a home admin. Okay, so just to confirm, right, let's do a sudo ifconfig. You can see that currently there's only one interface enabled, which is Ether1, right? Ethernet 1, private IP 10.108.0.4. Okay, I've disabled the external interface, right, on purpose so that we can simulate the client as if it is from a internal network. So as you can see, I only have one interface enabled, so no one will be able to reach my RDP host, right, from the internet itself, right? Of course, from the local LAN, you will still be able to reach the RDP host. Now, what we want to do is to now issue a command. So we create a remote port forwarding tunnel to the SSH server. So the command is SSH. The parameters or the option is -R, right, for remote port forwarding. Now, the syntax is in my web page itself. The standard syntax is quite straightforward. You have SSH -R followed by the SSH server IP address, the SSH port that you want to map to the internal application, the internal host or the RDP host in our case, IP address, and the actual internal application port itself. And then you can use the username and password login to the SSH server, or if you have gone through some of my tutorial, you can also use the key-based login. I'll show you both methods in this tutorial itself. Okay, so let's hop over and issue the actual command SSH -R. Right, we can provide the SSH server IP address, or to make it simple, we just key in the port we want to map to the application. So we have basically, for this tutorial, we're going to use 8443. Okay, next we will specify the IP address of the internal host, in our case internal RDP host, right? We can specify the IP address and configure the firewall, or we can use the local host, which is denoted by 127.0.1, right? And then the actual port, which is 3389 for XRDP, right? All this can be changed and customized, right, depending on your use case. But for simple tutorial like this is the syntax that you need to know, right? So a recap: 8443 is the port that you're going to expose to the public internet and where you need to open up your firewall. The localhost IP address 127.0.1 is actually the internal RDP host, right? So don't confuse this with the SSH server. This is actually the internal host IP address. Okay. the internal RDP host IP address and the actual port itself, right, which is 3389. Okay, so that's all, right? The command is that simple, right? Once that's done, you can use the user and password login method, right? If you have not turned on the key-based authentication, so the user is demo to delete add. Okay, the SSH server, right? If we recall, IP address is 10.10.108.0.2. Okay, so 10.108.0.2. Okay, so we are the whole server is 10.108.0.4. The SSH server is 0.0.2. Okay, enter, key in the password. Okay, and voila, right, we're in. So let's do a sudo ifconfig. Okay, you can see that my SSH server private IP address is 10.108.0.2. I have the public IP address exposed 209.97.159.99. I'm most likely going to delete off this instance, after a couple of tutorials. So, yep, you won't be able to get access to this server in the future. Okay, so let's do. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is first check the firewall ports. Right, you have W status verbose. Okay, you can see that we have not allowed 8443. So what you want to do is to first allow 8443. This is a quick and dirty way to allow 8443 through both IPv4 and v6, right? So if we look at the status again, right, now we have opened up the ports. Okay, now the next step, which is important, is to enable the gateway ports. Okay, so you want to make sure that we enable this server as a gateway for our remote port forwarding. Okay, this is where the default configuration for SSH is stored in Debian 11. Okay, once you're in there, you can do a Control W and look for gateway. Okay, so this is the gateway port configuration, right? The gateway ports are disabled by default, right? Which is a security measure, right? So what you want to do is to turn on the gateway port, right? So do Control X, yes. Okay, so you have configured the firewall, you have enabled the SSH configuration. You need to remember to do a restart of your SSH service or the SSH daemon. Okay, so by right, after doing all these things, technically you should be able to now connect using a RDP client, right? So we have configured the public IP address of the SSH server, followed by the SSH port that we have mapped for the RDP session, right? Let's click save, and then let's double click on this, right? However, suddenly you realize that, hey, I'm not able to connect, right? So it looks a bit weird, right? So do take note, right? Because we have configured this while, trying to create the remote port forwarding on the client itself. Therefore, this session, right, is actually invalid, right? So because we have initiated the port forwarding without opening the port 8443, which is not critical for that SSH tunnel, but because when we connected the SSH tunnel, the gateway port was not configured. Therefore, we can't do the SSH remote port forwarding. So what you're gonna do is just exit. If you follow my tutorial, like the way I do it, you will just need to exit from the SSH session previously and then reconnect the session. Oops, butterfinger. Okay, so we are in again. Okay, so we are back into the SSH server. Our port is open. Okay, now what we want to do is and we can just do a quick check. Let's just grab for gateway. Okay, so the gateway config port is yes. Okay, so we are done. So now let's hop back to the RDP client, and you can see that we now have no issue, right, connecting to the remote PC. Okay, so there are other configuration you can do to trust the cert, etc. But or when you do a key-based login, or if you have key-based login turn on as well, like me, right, you get some prompt, right? It's all right. You can just click on connect, okay, and then you need to provide the username and password, right? And voila, we're in, right? So if I now do a command, you can see that we have connected to the RDP host, the internal RDP host 10.108.0.4. Okay, so we have now successfully allowed a remote client, right, to connect to the RDP host, right, through the public IP address using port 8443, right? So we have now reached the RDP host on port 10.108.0.4 through a remote SSH tunnel, okay, or a reverse SSH tunnel, right, using the remote port forwarding method. So that's how easy it is to configure and establish that connection. Okay, so now for those of you who are interested in knowing the syntax for the key-based authentication, is actually very, very easy as well. So let's just exit this. And then on the command side, right, on top of the configuration, what you want to do is just to specify -i for the identity of the key. And you'll notice the difference, right? So slash hometutor.ssh. So you need to remember where your SSH key is stored. It's usually stored inside the hidden.ssh folder inside your user directory, right? So this is all you need to add in if you have already created an SSH key by specifying -i and the private key that you're going to log into the target server. Of course, you need to specify the username as well. Okay, the only difference now is that when I hit on enter, I will be prompted for a passphrase. So if you have seen my video on how to configure SSH key-based login, I have set up a passphrase for my private key. It's always a good practice to set that up, right, so that you protect your private key. So like in my case, I've been bringing down my demo private key around. So it is important to at least protect it with a password, so that in case somebody get access to my private key, they will still need to break the password to get access to my SSH server, right? So the only difference is now instead of keying the password of the user, all right, if you have passphrase set up, you need to key in the passphrase. Now, if you do not have a passphrase set up, the minute you issue the SSH -r command, you will actually be connected to the SSH server directly, right? Now, so this is all that it is, right? And then likewise, if I issue a command now, same thing, right? I'll be prompted to connect, and I can, key my username and password, and then I will get access to my RDP host inside my network. Okay, so I'm going to close this, right? So to wrap it up, so that's all it does. All you need to configure the configuration to allow or to create a remote port forwarding, so that an external admin can just connect to the port that is exposed on the firewall, right? And then with SSH remote port forwarding, the client doesn't have to have SSH, client installed. That means that the admin now do not need to install SSH over here, right? All they need to do is to use the application, right, that they use to connect to the internal host, and then through the port, right, get access to RDP. So you can do this for uh, web service, right, using HTTP, right? So you get, it's easy for you to just use a browser and get access. If you are managing Raspberry Pi through a custom HTTP port, you can do that as well. If you are trying to manage database, right, through this way or this method, right, you just need to basically make sure that you have the respective client, browser, and then you make sure that the port and the server IP address is mapped accordingly. Okay. Now, for those of you, especially like me, who are running, labs on a regular basis, and you want to um, set this up to run on the background, right? You can actually put in two options, right? It's inside my tutorial, right? So you can see that from this command, it is actually interactive, right? And then you get a remote prompt, right? Or a terminal. So you can actually use -F and -N, right, to um, not have a terminal, right, and hide this session in the background. So how can you do it, right? Same thing, right, with the same command, right? You need to just add in -F -N for a long way of doing it. And when you issue the command, right, you should see that a session is being established. If I do a netstat -ANTP, okay, I should see that a session is established, right? 22. Okay, let's do a quick test. And you can see that even without the remote prompt, remember the earlier tutorial or early part of the tutorial, right? We actually have a remote terminal session established, right? But for this, we don't, right? So we can still establish a session, right? You can see we are still inside internal RDP host versus the SSH server. Now, if we do a netstat -ANTP, right, we can see that there is a 3389 session established, right, on our local host through the SSH tunnel, right? So you can see we have now have a RDP XRDP session, right, through SSH, right, and you can identify it easily from the netstat command itself. Okay, so with that, I've come to the end of my tutorial. Hope this tutorial has been useful for you, and especially for those who have Linux machine as a lab development test machine in the cloud, and you might not want to set up a actual VPN or full-fledged VPN for a couple of servers like me. So SSH local forward tunneling or remote port tunneling is a good way to secure and get access to your server, or to reduce the exposed port on your cloud machine or your cloud servers. Okay, so thank you everyone for watching, um, and please continue to stay safe and take care. Thank you.